and let's just jump in. So I can't really gauge, I can't see everybody obviously, but it looks like we've had new people join. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. We are recording this, we are muting you, and we encourage you, if you're not on your phone and able to access your desktop window, to go ahead and use the chat. Feel free to tell us where you're calling in from, city and agency, and also as we prompt you for some of your thoughts, we'd love to hear from you. Okay, so we are here to talk about changing the feedback experience for the better, and yes, it is possible. So before we jump in, I wanted to ask first for you all to just reflect for a moment in your own experiences, especially given your roles. It's likely that you've been in a position of both receiving feedback and giving feedback, probably recently, but if not, over the course of your careers. I want you to just take a moment to ponder back on those experiences. What has it been like for you when you've received feedback? And how about even sometimes when you've had to give it? And if you thought about maybe just some adjectives that come to mind, some feeling words that would describe that, we'd love to hear some of those pop up in the chat window. No need to get into details of any of the actual experiences, but just what comes to mind when you think about the experience of giving and receiving feedback. What words or feelings or emotions come up as you reflect back on those? Okay, I'm seeing awkward. Receiving is great when it's actionable. Yep, so it can be stressful, opportunity, tense, nervous, time consuming. Hear that for sure. Rewarding. Oh, somebody just had feedback yesterday. It was objective, active listening, listening with an innocent mind and a way forward. Good. Sounds like you showed up well to that. Hopefully the feedback mirrored it. Giving it is difficult when there's no relationship. Yeah, we're going to talk about that briefly. Receiving it, you're eager for it. It happens rarely. Well, that's unfortunate. We will talk about some of the benefits and reasons why you want to be giving it more so. Low, well, I'll find out today how it was received. Okay, it sounds like maybe somebody's in the midst of preparing some. Stressful, it can be stressful giving it to senior level folks, especially when they think that they know everything or that they're always right. Yes, I think you might learn some things today that maybe could help with that. Others are agreeing with that. Great. Awesome. Feel free to keep chiming in. When we ask this question, a lot of times we do this presentation live at conferences and whatnot, and we'll kind of just ask the audience to popcorn out words. And oftentimes we get words that mimic what this little comic here shares, because unfortunately what we've come to realize is everybody's had at least one terrible feedback experience so badly. Oftentimes there's a little bit of PTSD left over from that. And unfortunately, sometimes people have had multiple bad experiences, and it's almost the rarity that they've had a really good or useful one. And so that's a lot of what brings us here today. Pete and I wrote a mission statement that was as simple as: we want to change the experience, the feedback experience, one leader at a time and one organization at a time. And so that's really what we're here to talk to you about, is some really simple and useful strategies for how we can do that. So the reason why we want to change that feedback experience is because our point of view is that feedback in organizations today is broken. And there's a few primary reasons why we say that. First and foremost, oftentimes feedback, because it's not given so often, and somebody mentioned that, it's oftentimes tied to performance reviews. And so right there in and of itself, the intent is compromised. If somebody knows they're weighing in on someone else's feedback and they know that their colleague or friend is up for that promotion, or they know it's raise time, they don't want to be the one to give the negative feedback or something that's maybe more constructive or helpful, because they don't want to run the risk of that person not progressing in the organization. And so the compromise, the intent is compromised. Also, what we hear and see is oftentimes, if not always, the feedback comes back as anonymous. So if a 360 was done, or even if informally other feedback was collected, rarely, if ever, is it shared who's giving the weighing in on the feedback. And as you can imagine, context matters when it comes to feedback. It means something different if it's a direct report versus a manager versus a peer, and what department that peer's from. And so that's an issue with feedback. Feedback can be really focused on what's not working. We're going to talk about this a little bit more in a bit, but our brains are just more naturally inclined to see what's broken or what's fixed, or have more of a negativity bias. And that's not really the most useful information for people when they're trying to create change, is focusing on what's not working. And so that's another reason why feedback is broken. And lastly, oftentimes feedback, when it is even prepared and given, rarely is it then followed up upon. So even if that person is trying to address the feedback, who's really looking out, noticing, and positively reinforcing that feedback as they see those changes occurring? And that's rarely happening. So it lacks that sense of follow through and positive reinforcement. So, for all of these reasons and more, this is leaving employees feeling isolated, alone, confused, and worse off, oftentimes, that their employees or their colleagues, excuse me, are almost against them instead of with them. And that's not what feedback should create. We should feel like we're all in each other's corner trying to help each other be the best that we can possibly be. Another reason why we say feedback is broken, thanks for the amen. Another reason why we say feedback is broken is because of the way that it's delivered. And if you're familiar at all with David Rock, who is in the field of neuroscience, he does a fantastic work. And what he speaks to is what he calls the SCARF model. And SCARF essentially standing for this acronym of these 5 areas: status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And essentially what his research shows is when we feel a threat toward any one of these 5 things, we actually go into that fight or flight response. We respond to that threat in the same exact way we would if our lives were actually being threatened. It's that idea of you're hiking in the woods and you see a stick up ahead, but for a second your eyes tell you it's a snake, and you have that immediate reaction. That's actually the reaction that's created in our body and in our brains when one of these 5 things are threatened. And so I ask all of you, how many of these 5 things do you think could come up in a feedback discussion, could feel threatened by feedback? Does anybody have a guess out of the 5 listed here? Yep, somebody already said it. Yeah, exactly. All 5 of these, really. And so when we're preparing the feedback, we need to be keeping this in mind. We need to be putting ourselves in the other person's shoes and imagining what they might react to. And so I'm not going to spend the time going through this list here today, but you'll have this when we share out the presentation today. But we basically have created these anecdotes here on the right, which are the things that you want to be dialing up more to help mitigate the threat response that's there on the left. And so we're oftentimes just not considering these things when we're considering how we're delivering the feedback, and that matters. So in essence, the feedback experience is broken truly due to both design and delivery flaws. And so what we feel it is finally time to change that feedback experience and to make it the energizing and constructive experience that it was intended to be. We often hear that saying that feedback is a gift, but Pete and I say all the time, why doesn't it feel like a nice little present that you unwrap when it feels like when you actually are opening a gift? And why can't it feel that way? And so I want to invite you to consider a whole new way. Whoops, before I do that, actually, I forgot this because I was in here. So yeah, when we think about changing that feedback experience, then what primarily do we mean? And when we think about feedback at its best, there's some key pillars that it really needs to include. First of all, somebody mentioned this already in the chat window, that feedback can be really difficult when there's no relationship there. And that's because you really want to trust the intention of the person sharing it with you, that you really want to know that the feedback is truly for your benefit, that they have your growth and your best interest in mind. Second, as I briefly mentioned before, context really does matter. You want to understand the circumstances for which that feedback occurred. If you're referencing back to an example or a time when the person did it, it's helpful for them to understand who said that, when was I doing it, when did it happen, because that matters as well. That's good context. And then rather than simply understanding somebody's weaknesses, which I'll give you our point of view on that here in a moment, it's really more important to understand what you want the person to do, what you want them to do instead. So it's simply not enough. It's insufficient to highlight for them what's not working without them turning around and telling them what behaviors you'd like to see them employing instead. So we're going to focus a lot on that here, and we'll actually do an exercise on that during the call today. Feedback is also at its best when it's timely. I think everybody can relate, I'm sure, with the millennials in full force demanding ongoing real-time feedback. And I kind of love that the millennials are asking for everything that we all wanted in our careers, but now they're kind of taking the fall for being more vocal about it. But regardless, they are right in wanting real-time feedback. Feedback is the most useful when it's timely and it's in the moment versus being saved up for that annual review. And lastly, we'll talk about this a lot too towards the end of the discussion, this idea of social support, that we need people helping to notice the progress we make and to reinforce it. That's really what helps change to actually stick and for us to actually improve. So when giving the feedback, it's not enough to just give it and let it go. Who's following up on it? Who's keeping an eye out to notice what's happening, and who's providing that social support? So that's really what we consider some of the key factors that allows feedback to be at its best. Now, when we talk about changing that experience of feedback, now I want to invite you to imagine feedback if it went like this. Imagine that I surveyed a handful of your colleagues and I asked them, what are the things that you love about this person? Tell me how they are when they're at their absolute best. How do they show up? What are they doing at their best? And what are a bunch of their core strengths? If you got feedback that painted a picture for you at your absolute best and included your actual strengths that people saw in you, what that would feel like. And then if your peers and colleagues went a step further and actually detailed for you some ways and ideas and strategies for how you could be even more effective in your role. If they took the time to actually name what you could be doing differently and how that would look if you were even more effective in your role, they painted that picture. And finally, anyone that weighed in on the feedback also had the obligation and willingness to commit to something that they too either could do differently or that they would commit to you to help set you up for success. So whatever area that they've got feedback for you in, they too have strengths and maybe can offer something very specific for you in that way. So it's not enough anymore for you to just say the areas where someone else could grow. You also should be actively involved in that process. So what is one thing that you're willing to do? So if in the end you received feedback that painted a picture of you at your best, as well as all the ways you could be more effective and all the things that the people around you could offer up to help get you there, how would that feel? And I invite you to feel free to respond in the chat. But again, when we talk about changing the feedback experience, that's really what we mean. That the feedback experience, if there were three kind of core pieces to it, that those are really what the three are. And we're going to dive into those in a little bit more detail now. So, sorry, my clicker is delayed. Here we go. So really, our method of feedback is called the Shift Positive method. And what we're going to walk you through today is two of its grounding principles. So we'll talk about the how you change the feedback experience, and that's primarily through taking more of a positive psychology mindset. And we're going to walk you through exactly what we mean by that. And then we're going to talk about the who's involved in the feedback, because we know that feedback needs to reach well beyond just the person receiving it. To the point that I was just making about needing that support, we're going to talk to you about what it means to actually create systems of support so you can create a feedback structure in your organization that will help people to truly thrive by focusing on that support. I just want to mention here too, so Pete and I are the co-founders of the Shift Positive method, what we're talking to you about today. We initially launched it as a 360 tool, for which we still use, and we actually certify and train other executive coaches and HRBPs in our process for the 360. But what we came to realize was we actually have all of these strategies and concepts that actually roll right into training managers or helping executives understand how to frame feedback in a different way. So we'll talk more about that at the end. But when I say the Shift Positive method, it's really become an entire umbrella, a mindset, if you will, and an approach for how to change this feedback experience to be far more constructive and energizing.